door wasn't fully closed. Daniel's voice slipped through, low and amused. She feels responsible for him. Poor old man's got nothing left. A pause, then quiet laughter. My hand stayed on the handle, unmoving, like I didn't belong on either side of it. My name is Arthur Bennett. I am 72, and I had just heard my son-in-law reduce me to a burden inside. A folder with Emily's name rested open on the table. If you've ever stood quietly while someone rewrote your worth in a room you built, stay with me and tell me where that moment changed you. I have lived on Maplewood Lane long enough for the house to feel less like a place I own and more like a witness that chose not to leave. The floor by the kitchen sink gives a little under my right foot. The screen door rattles when the wind turns. In the mornings, light comes through the window above the table in a pale strip that moves across the wood. Nothing in that house performs. Nothing asks to be admired. It simply tells the truth. George Miller once stood on the other side of my fence with dirt on his forearms and laughed at the way I kept patching the same loose board instead of replacing it. "Arthur," he said, "one of these days that thing's just going to give up." I looked at the fence, then at him. "So far," I said. "It still knows its job." He laughed. My father taught me that before I was old enough to understand the lesson. I can still see him beside the creek behind our old place. The water moving around stones dark with moss. The evening air cool enough to sting my hands. He watched the current as if truth might surface if you stayed quiet long enough. "The river doesn't fight the rock," he told me. I remember looking down at the water and thinking the river looked weak. He must have seen it on my face, because he gave the smallest smile. "It keeps moving," he said. "That's different." I carried that sentence long enough for it to become the shape of my life. By the time Emily was little, I had already built the habit of letting the world underestimate me. She grew up in that house on Maplewood Lane with its warm kitchen and uneven floors. She sat at my table in sock feet, pencil tucked behind one ear, asking questions in a tone so calm it took people too long to realize they were being cornered. One evening, she wanted to stay up later. I said no. She folded her hands on the table, looked at me with those clear, steady eyes, and began laying out her case with the kind of patience most adults never learn. The kitchen smelled faintly of dish soap and black tea. A moth kept tapping itself against the porch light outside. By the time she finished, I had agreed to terms I had no memory of offering. She grinned and slid off the chair like she had known the outcome all along. I sat there listening to the old refrigerator hum and thought, she is going to walk through life with her own mind intact. That mattered to me more than any inheritance ever could. People assume a man keeps power visible because he wants credit for it. I never cared much for credit. I cared about control, privacy, and the difference between being loved for what you provide and being loved for who you are when the room is quiet. So I built Vanguard Crest Holdings in layers, carefully, without tying my public life to its full shape: real estate, logistics, media. All of it structured so that my name did not need to sit at the front of anything for me to own it. Emily grew up knowing I worked hard. She knew I was disciplined. She knew the house was paid for and the pantry stayed full. But she did not grow up under the shadow of my holdings. I would not let her. I never wanted her to look at me and see an empire before she saw her father. That choice cost something. Secrecy always does. It buys freedom with misunderstanding. Still, I paid it willingly. When Emily brought Daniel into my house for the first time, the first thing I noticed was not his face. It was his timing. Men tell the truth in timing. He answered half a beat too fast, laughed half a beat too knowingly. Every story he offered arrived already polished, as though he had held it up to a mirror before bringing it into someone else's home. He was handsome in the disciplined way of men who maintain themselves with purpose. His clothes fit too well to be accidental. His watch caught the light whenever he moved his hand. He spoke warmly to Emily, respectfully to me. On paper, there was nothing to dislike. Then he began arranging the room without touching anything. Every conversation bent toward him. Every subject found its way back to something he had done, somewhere he had gone. Someone important who had noticed him, not crudely, smoothly. That was what made it interesting. A man can fake humility for 15 minutes, sometimes for an evening. It is harder to fake what he notices, what he dismisses, and how his mouth changes when he thinks no one useful is listening. I wanted truth, even when truth arrived wearing expensive shoes. I did not make up my mind that night. Impatience rarely improves judgment. Northbridge Logistics was in need of leadership, and Daniel's credentials were real enough to merit a serious look. The process that followed was clean, formal, and ordinary. Interviews, evaluations, quiet review. Everything a company is supposed to do when deciding who will sit at the top of a functioning machine. I watched all of it from a distance close enough to matter. I read the notes. I looked at the recommendations. I paid attention to what people wrote when they thought they were being objective. Daniel presented well, better than well. He knew how to wear confidence without letting it look like desperation. And that can carry a man a long way. That evening, Emily called me, happiness rising through every word. Daniel had accepted the role at Northbridge. She was proud of him. A few minutes later, a message came from him. Short, triumphant, self-satisfied in a way that tried to sound grateful. I answered with courtesy and set the phone down on my kitchen table. Then I went outside and stood in the yard until the night settled fully around me. What Daniel did instead was become more himself. It started in rooms full of company people. A hand on my shoulder, a polished smile. "This is Arthur," he would say. "Emily's dad, retired." If someone asked what I had done before, he had a way of answering for me without seeming to interrupt. He narrowed the frame until I fit inside it as something harmless, finished, decorative. What struck me was not the insult itself. It was the ease of it. He did not lower me because he was angry. He lowered me because he found it useful. The first time I saw Emily register it, she was holding a glass at a company gathering, her fingers still around the stem. Her expression calm, except for her eyes. She looked at me, then at him, then back at me, as though something in the air had shifted and she could feel it without yet naming it. I gave her the smallest nod. "Not here," that nod said. The contract Daniel signed when he took Northbridge was one I knew closely. I had built its spine years before his name ever entered my life. There was a non-compete clause in it and a fiduciary duty clause, both written in plain language. Nothing theatrical, just a clean protection against the oldest temptation in business, using a house someone else built to construct an exit for yourself. The weeks passed. Emily called. Daniel advanced. The pattern deepened. At home on Maplewood Lane, the kettle still hissed softly in the evenings. George still leaned over the fence now and then to complain about squirrels as if they were unionized. My life remained outwardly small, and that smallness kept working on Daniel exactly the way pride always works on a certain kind of man. It convinced him he was being accurate. By the time the invitation from Robert and Eleanor arrived, I already understood more than anyone expected me to. I knew the kind of family they were before I ever stepped into their house. Status-minded, polished. Emily wanted us all to be comfortable together. I could hear hope in her voice when she mentioned dinner after we hung up. I stood in my hallway and looked at my reflection in the narrow mirror by the door. Silver hair, simple shirt, an old man with a steady face and no obvious use to ambitious people. Then I opened my closet and looked past the suits in the back, past every visible version of authority, and reached for the simplest clothes I owned. The first real shift happened in a room full of people who believed they understood exactly who belonged where. It was a Northbridge gathering, one of those carefully balanced events where conversation floats just above honesty. Glasses clinked softly. Low music filled the edges of the room, and people spoke in voices trained not to carry too far. I stood near the back, not hidden, just unclaimed. Daniel spotted me and moved in my direction with practiced ease, two executives trailing slightly behind him. He rested his hand briefly on my shoulder, a gesture that looked like inclusion from a distance. "This is Arthur," he said, smiling. "Emily's dad. He enjoys the quiet life these days." The men nodded politely, One of them asked a question about logistics expansion before I could respond. Daniel turned smoothly, answering it in detail, guiding the conversation away from me without ever appearing to do so. Within seconds, I was no longer part of the exchange. I remained where I was, listening as my presence dissolved into the background noise of the room. There was no hostility in it. That was what made it precise. I had not been dismissed. I had been redefined. Across the room, Emily was watching again. Her posture was relaxed, but her attention was not. She understood something was happening, but not yet what it meant. I gave her the same small nod. Not here. The next time it happened. It was not in a corporate room, but at the Clark estate. Westbrook Hills has a way of presenting wealth as if it were a natural condition, like weather. The house stood at the top of a long, curved drive, framed by hedges trimmed into shapes that suggested control rather than care. When I stepped out of my car, a young attendant approached, his expression already forming an opinion before he spoke. "Good evening, sir," he said, his eyes flicking briefly to the car behind me. I handed him the keys without comment. Inside, the house carried a scent of polished surfaces and something floral that felt more placed than grown. Eleanor greeted me with both hands, her smile warm enough to be convincing if you didn't listen too closely. "Arthur," she said, her voice lifting slightly, "you look absolutely adorable tonight." There it was again, adorable. A word that carries softness on the surface and weight underneath. It does not describe a man. It reduces him. I thanked her. Robert joined us moments later, already mid-conversation about market shifts and long-term positioning. He spoke with the steady authority of someone accustomed to being listened to without interruption. Daniel stood beside him, aligned, engaged, absorbing approval. "And Daniel," Robert said, raising his glass slightly, "has been doing remarkable work, truly remarkable." Daniel nodded modestly, but his eyes moved briefly toward me, measuring, waiting for acknowledgement that did not come. Dinner unfolded in layers of polite conversation and carefully directed praise. Every subject returned, eventually, to Daniel, his decisions, his vision, his future. At one point, Eleanor turned to Emily with a smile that looked effortless. "You must feel very secure," she said, "having a husband who provides so well. It's such a comfort." Emily smiled back, but it did not reach her eyes. I said nothing, because moments like that are not about what is said. They are about what is assumed. The proposal came later, not announced, introduced. A leather folder was placed on the table with deliberate care. Robert's hand rested on it for a moment before he slid it toward me. The movement was smooth, practiced, rehearsed. "We've been discussing an opportunity," he said, his tone measured. "Something that could establish Daniel independently, a venture of his own." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his confidence contained but present. "It's a strong model," he added, "backed by everything I've built so far." Everything he had built. The phrasing was intentional. I opened the folder. Inside were projections, structures, timelines, clean, professional, persuasive, and at the center of it, a condition framed as both logical and temporary: Emily's inheritance, to be used as collateral. The room did not go silent. It narrowed. Emily's hand tightened in her lap. Daniel's attention stayed fixed on me, not aggressively, but with the quiet certainty of someone expecting agreement. "It's a family investment," Robert said. "Aligned interests, shared success," Eleanor added. "Of course, only if everyone is comfortable." Comfort, another word that does not mean what it sounds like. I closed the folder slowly. "I'll review it," I said. Relief moved through the table like a subtle current. They believed the decision had already been made. On the drive back to Maplewood Lane, the road felt longer than usual. Streetlights passed in steady intervals, casting brief patterns across the dashboard. I replayed the evening, not with anger, but with attention. The proposal was not the offense. The assumption was that I would not understand it, that I would not question it, that I would accept it because I had been placed, carefully and repeatedly, into a role that required nothing more. The next morning, Daniel sent a message. "Hope you had time to go through everything. It's a great opportunity." I let it sit. Another followed later. Excited to move forward on this. I read both. Then I placed my phone face down on the table and reached for the contract. The paper felt familiar under my hand. The clause sat exactly where it always had, clear, direct, uncomplicated. From there, I initiated the review, quietly. No announcements, no disruption, just a request through the proper channels. Standard procedure. The kind that does not raise suspicion until it produces results. The first findings arrived within days. Fragments at first, unusual meeting schedules, repeated use of internal systems for external planning, contacts that extended beyond the scope of company business. Individually, they were explainable. Together, they formed a direction. I read each line carefully, not searching for guilt, but for pattern. The pattern held. The full report took longer. When it arrived, I did not open it immediately. I let it rest on the table beside the proposal folder. 2 documents, one built on assumption, the other on fact. When I finally read it, I did so slowly. Every entry confirmed what had already begun to take shape. Daniel had been building something parallel, not openly, not recklessly, carefully, intentionally, using the structure he believed he controlled. Company time, company resources, company access. All of it documented, all of it in direct conflict with the agreement he had signed. I closed the report and placed it beside the contract. 3 points. Contract. Proposal. Audit. The line between them was now clear. The final moment came quietly. Another gathering. Smaller this time. Family only. The atmosphere was relaxed on the surface. Casual conversation. Light laughter. The kind of setting where expectations are softened, not removed. Robert spoke again about legacy. Eleanor spoke about stability. Daniel spoke about vision. Emily listened. At one point, Daniel placed his hand over hers. "Everything's handled," he said softly. Not to her. To the table. To me. That was the moment. Not because of what he said, because of what he believed. Control. Ownership. I watched Emily's expression shift. Just slightly. Not understanding, not agreement, something closer to unease. I stood shortly after. Thanked them. Left without interruption. Back at Maplewood Lane. I sat at the kitchen table and placed the 3 documents in front of me once more. The house was quiet. The light above the sink flickered once before settling. I rested my hand on the audit report, not in anger, in certainty. The path forward was no longer a question. It had already been chosen, not by me, by him. And for the first time since I had met Daniel, I understood exactly how this would end. Not loudly, not publicly, but in a room where he believed he was still in control. That belief would be the last thing he lost. The conference room felt different the moment I stepped inside, as if the space itself understood that whatever happened here would not be undone. The blinds were half drawn, letting in narrow bands of afternoon light that stretched across the table like quiet divisions. The air carried the faint scent of polished wood and something colder beneath it. Papers were already arranged with deliberate precision. The board sat to my left, legal to my right. No one filled the silence with small talk. I took the seat at the head of the table. I rested my hands lightly on the folder in front of me, feeling the edges align under my fingers. The audit report sat inside. Beneath it, the contract, both clean, both final. No one asked why I was there. They already knew. The door opened. Daniel walked in with the same confidence I had seen since the beginning. Shoulders relaxed, expression neutral. A man stepping into a room he believed he owned. Then he saw me. It did not happen all at once. Recognition rarely does. It moves in pieces. First confusion, then recalculation, then the slow arrival of something harder to ignore. His step faltered, just enough to notice. He looked at the board, at the legal team, then back at me. The room held him there. "Sit down, Daniel," I said. My voice was quiet. It did not need anything more. He sat. The chair made a soft, controlled sound as it met the floor. He adjusted his posture, trying to reclaim something familiar, something steady. "This wasn't on my calendar," he said. "It is now," I replied. A flicker crossed his face. Not anger, not yet. Something closer to uncertainty. He folded his hands in front of him. "If there is a concern," he said, "carefully measured, we can address it." I opened the folder. "This is not a discussion," I said. The room tightened. He leaned back slightly, watching me with a new kind of attention. I slid the first document forward. "The company you run," I said, "is not independent." He said nothing. Northbridge Logistics operates under Vanguard Crest Holdings. His jaw shifted, almost imperceptibly. And Vanguard Crest Holdings, I continued, is owned by me. Silence, not the kind that fills space, the kind that removes it. For a moment, Daniel did not move. His eyes stayed on mine, as if waiting for something to contradict what he had just heard. Nothing did. You're saying, he began. I'm stating, I said. His gaze dropped to the table, then lifted again, sharper now, searching for angles that no longer existed. You approved my appointment, he said. Yes. The words settled between us like something that had always been there. The board remained still. No one shifted. No one offered him an opening. There wasn't one. I turned the page. For the past several months, I said, you've been engaged in activities that directly violate your employment agreement. His expression hardened. I don't know what you're referring to. I slid the audit report across the table. It stopped just within his reach. He stared at it. Then, slowly, he opened it. His eyes moved across the page, line by line, entry by entry. Meeting records, communication logs, internal access used for external planning. Each detail placed exactly where it belonged. The room remained silent, except for the faint sound of paper shifting under his hands. He turned another page, then another. The confidence he had carried into the room did not collapse. It drained. What is this? He asked. A record, I said. His jaw tightened. This doesn't prove. I placed the contract beside the report. You signed this, I said. He didn't look at it immediately. You agreed to a non-compete clause. I continued. You agreed to act in the company's best interest. His eyes moved to the signature at the bottom of the page. His signature. You've been building a competing venture, I said, using company resources. He leaned forward now, tension replacing posture. That's not accurate. It is. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. The legal team shifted slightly, not interrupting, but confirming presence. The board remained aligned, their silence no longer neutral. Daniel looked around the room. For the first time, he understood there was no audience left to perform for. You set this up, he said. The accusation lacked force. I gave you a position, I replied. You chose how to use it. He looked back at me, something unsteady passing through his expression. Not anger, recognition. I let it sit. There are two outcomes, I said. His attention fixed completely now. You resign, I continued. Effective immediately. Your reputation remains intact. This ends here. I paused. Or we proceed legally. Everything in that report becomes public. The words did not echo. They settled. Daniel looked down at the documents again. His hands rested on either side of the pages, not touching them now, as if distance might change what they contained. He exhaled slowly. Emily, he said, quieter now. Does she know? No. The answer was simple. He nodded once. The silence that followed was longer than any before it. When he spoke again, the resistance was gone. I'll resign. There was no negotiation in it, no attempt to reclaim ground, just a decision made with full understanding of what stood in front of him. Good, I said. I closed the folder. The sound was soft. Final. Chairs shifted as the room began to move again. Papers gathered, pens set down. The meeting, for everyone else, was already over. I stood. Then I stopped. One more thing. Daniel looked up. The proposal your parents presented, I said. Emily's inheritance. A flicker of expectation crossed his face. It has already been transferred, I continued, fully, into her name. Irrevocable. The words landed without emphasis. There was nothing left to take from it. There is nothing available for you to use, I added. His shoulders lowered, just slightly. The last assumption removed. I stepped away from the table. No one followed. No one spoke. As I reached the door, I paused. Not long, just enough. Then I opened it and stepped out into the hallway. The door closed behind me with a quiet, controlled click. Inside that room, Daniel remained seated with the documents in front of him, the shape of his certainty gone. For the first time since I had known him, he was no longer directing anything. Not the room, not the outcome, not the story he had been telling himself. And in that stillness, everything he believed he controlled finally belonged to someone else. The air outside Northbridge felt strangely ordinary. Cars moved below. A siren sounded in the distance, then faded. I stood on the steps for a moment with my hand on the rail, letting the quiet settle inside me. By evening, Daniel's resignation was complete. The statement was brief and empty. He was leaving to pursue other opportunities. No one reading it would understand what it had cost him. That was the point. The board got stability. Legal got containment. Daniel got the last mercy I was willing to offer him. Northbridge moved on quickly. Access changed. Authority shifted. His place at the table was gone. The machine kept running, which is how you know a man has confused position with power. I drove home to Maplewood Lane before dusk. The house waited as it always had. The porch, the narrow steps, the soft rattle in the screen door when I opened it. Home does not ask who you have become before it lets you in. Inside. I set my keys down and went to the kitchen. Kettle, teacups, the worn grain of the table. I filled the kettle, set it on the stove, and placed a slim folder in the center of the table. Emily arrived before the water finished heating. She came in fast and controlled. Her eyes found my face immediately. "Dad," she said. "Daniel told me he resigned." I nodded. "And he said you were there." I was. She sat across from me. The kettle began to murmur. "What happened?" she asked. I slid the folder toward her. She opened it carefully. Inside was the confirmation of transfer. Her inheritance now fully in her name, protected, requiring her signature and no one else's. She read the first page, then the next. "You moved it?" "Oh," she said at last. "Yes," before they could touch it. "Yes." She looked up, and I watched understanding arrive in layers. First confusion, then the shape of the dinner proposal, then the harder truth beneath it. They had believed they could use her future. They had believed I would let them. Color rose in her face. "I didn't know," she said quietly. "I know." Her fingers tightened on the paper. "I thought he was ambitious. I thought maybe he was pushing too hard. But I didn't." She stopped and looked down. I let the silence hold. When she spoke again, her voice was smaller. Did they really think I was something to leverage? That question landed harder than anything Daniel had said in the conference room. "Yes," I answered. She closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, there was water in them now, but not weakness. Clarity. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "because I should have seen what they were making you into." I reached across the table and rested my hand over hers. "No," I said. "You are loving your husband. That is trust placed in the wrong person." A tear slipped free, and she gave a short, broken laugh as she wiped it away. "He really had no idea who you were, did he?" I almost smiled. "No," I said. "He knew exactly who I looked like." That made her laugh again, softer this time. I told her the rest then. Daniel had used company resources to build something against the company he was being paid to lead. The contract covered it. The board confirmed it. Legal was ready. I gave him a quiet exit because destruction was never the point. Protection was. When I finished, Emily stared at the folder for a long time. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" she asked. "About any of it." I looked out the window. "Because I wanted you to choose your life," I said, "not react to mine." Her face broke then, just enough to show me the child still living somewhere inside the woman she had become. She reached across the table, and I took her hand fully in mine. That was the real payoff, not Daniel's resignation, not the quiet collapse of the Clark family's assumptions. This, my daughter sitting in my kitchen with her future returned to her own hands. The folder stayed between us on the table, no longer a threat, just proof. Outside, evening settled over Maplewood Lane. The kettle clicked softly as it cooled. Nothing in that moment looked dramatic. The chairs, the table, the kitchen light. But the order of things had changed. Daniel had lost his position, his leverage, and the illusion that he could enter my life, rearrange it, and leave with more than he came for. Emily had something no one at that dinner table had planned on giving her, freedom with her own name on it, and I had my voice back where it belonged, at home, at the table. If this story meant something to you, it may be because you've known what it feels like to be quietly diminished. To sit in a room you helped build and hear your worth reduced to something convenient. Strength does not always look loud. Sometimes it looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like waiting until the right moment to speak. And then speaking once. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought they understood your limits, I'd genuinely like to hear about it. Leave a comment and tell me what that moment taught you. Where were you? What changed after that? And if stories about family, dignity, and quiet power resonate with you, consider subscribing so you can follow along when the next one unfolds. Tonight, the kitchen is still. The folder with Emily's name rests closed on the table. The light above the sink hums softly. My daughter's future belongs to her, not to anyone who tried to bargain with it. And I sit there a little longer than usual, hands folded, knowing that silence can carry more weight than any raised voice ever could.